Looks like everyone's had a bit of a chat already. Let's have a look. So I'm going to read down in a moment, but yeah, I'm wearing the same shirt as yesterday. Um, yeah, so feel free to give this a thumbs up if you end up liking this, finding it interesting at all. Feel free to subscribe if you want to kind of keep up with more that I do, like the sleep meditations and what have you. Hello, those of you who are already here. Looks like you've had a full on conversation already. So I'm just reading through, see what you talked about while I wasn't here. Yeah, why did you arrive 15 minutes early? Da, 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 da. Yes, I sleep, not necessarily at the right times, but I sleep. It would be nice to be able to shut down half my brain at a time. It's not a bunny that's in here, but it's small and near the camera. Well, not small, small, but normal size. Doesn't have a name. Yeah, haven't even started yet, and I'm already scrolling through loads of stuff. I remember learning when I was younger. I don't know how true it is that if you that rabbit's one of the few things that if you tried to just eat that, um, you would die from it. I really, really hate the smell of cooked rabbit. Right, and I've got to the bottom of the chat. That's always a good thing. So make sure everything's working around me. Hopefully everyone's okay on this chocolate Sunday or whatever the day is, if we know what the day is. I don't really have anything planned. Oh, you can see the eye of my animal. Yeah, I've never tried cooked kangaroo or raw kangaroo either. As long as the smell doesn't drive you hopping mad. I feel like this is further away from me than normal. But I've been coming on here live every day, so nothing should have moved. Weird. Well, the smell of rabbit can drive you hopping mad, so maybe kangaroo can too. Kangaroo can too. I look smaller. Do I look taller now? Just move that out of the way. Yeah. Sleeping's good. I'm going to attempt to stick to an hour. See how I get on with that one. I've literally just finished drinking a coffee. Just wondering where I put my water. Putting it near some of my books. I always worry putting drinks on shelves near books, that I'm going to somehow spill it on them or something. I knew someone who used to frequently lose his drinks. He would do things like he'd put it down on the windowsill while he draws his curtains, and then he'd forget that he's put it down on the windowsill, and then he'd make himself another one, and then that one he'd accidentally put like in the fridge instead of the milk going back in the fridge, and then he'd make himself another one, and then he'd end up walking around his flat finding all these undrunk coffees everywhere. Yes, I'm terrible with time. And I think many of us must be, because my streams keep on going on long. So I don't know what I'm going to talk about today yet. Obviously, yesterday we talked about Dr. David Lewis's books and the stuff that David does. Glad that the sleep stuff has been helpful. Pretty much. I've got some really low shelves, obviously the ones right at the bottom, that are my kind of I almost never touch these books shelves. So that's things like books from when I was like a kid and things like that, that I hardly ever touch. So because I almost never go near those ones, which is why they're on the bottom, I wouldn't necessarily be able to direct you to the exact location if someone said to me something and I said, "Oh, I've got that book," and then went and found it. Yeah, I couldn't find the old one that you asked me about the other day. Part of it is because I've got a really bright light right in front of me, so anytime I try and actually look at my shelves, I end up staring into the light, and then all I see is lots and lots of dots in front of me for ages, and then I can't actually see anything on any shelf. How do I come up with the stories so fast? I open my mouth. I don't know. It's what any therapist can do, I'd assume. It's what you would expect any therapist to have learned to do. That you get content from a client and then you feed that content back, and you just do it in real time. It's something that confuses me and kind of irritates me in relation to hypnotherapists, trainee hypnotherapists, at times. The fact that literally in any other profession, so in any other therapy profession, yeah, if you're a counselor, if you trained as a counselor, or if you've trained as a psychotherapist or whatever, you don't sit in front, you don't get a counselor who has their client come in, and then that client sits down in front of them, and then the client tells the problem, and then the counselor says, "I've got to go away, write a script, I'll come back to you next week." It doesn't happen. So whereas in hypnotherapy, it's incredibly common to meet hypnotherapists who don't seem to have learned the therapy part of hypnotherapy, because obviously hypnosis isn't a therapy. Hypnosis is just focusing attention, increasing responsivity. The therapy is whatever you've learned to do with the hypnosis, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy, Perhaps it's solution focused therapy, maybe it's psychoanalytic or psychodynamic therapy. Whatever the therapy is that you've learned to do with the hypnosis, that's what you should be doing. And so it does confuse me when hypnotherapists constantly want to churn out more scripts rather than actually do therapy. Um, so I'm aware that some hypnotherapists probably can't do what I do, pardon me, but I'd imagine that any therapist who's trained as a therapist could, because that's what you do. You look at a client opposite you. The client will say things like, say they're talking about their partner and they've got maybe relationship problems. They might sort of say, "Oh yeah, I get on fine with them," and they might rub their neck. And so they've metaphorically just told you he's a pain in the neck or she's a pain in the neck. Um, they might push down with their heels into the ground as you say certain things, as if to be digging their heels in. So again, that's a metaphor you can then use. They might talk about needing to gain perspective on something. So then there's another thing that you use when you create your kind of therapy, that they need to gain perspective. So maybe you're going to have them fly like a bird or something. Maybe you're going to have them climb a mountain. Maybe you're going to have them look out to sea. So you're doing all these kind of bits just as if you're a trained therapist, this is just what you do. It's your daily job. The only difference I do, so when it comes to how do I come up with it all so quickly, I come up with it all as quickly as any therapist would. That if you've seen the live streams like will happen on Monday night, so Monday night my time, where I do the meditations live on air, it happens in real time. It literally is. People give you the content, you turn that content into the therapy, so to speak, into a healing sleep meditation in this case. And that's all you're doing. You're doing something that you do every day in therapy if you work as a therapist, except that instead of having a client give the content, you're having multiple people who've joined in to give the content. So that's kind of how I come up with the stories so fast, because I've been given the content and all I'm doing is feeding back that content like you would as a therapist. A cat on your bladder and you need coffee. As long as the cat doesn't start jumping about. But yeah, so I don't think of what I do as being anything particularly impressive or anything that others couldn't just go ahead and do themselves. I'm betting that literally anyone in the live chat could be given a bunch of information and could quite easily just turn that into something therapeutic. They could think, right, that would make a good metaphor for teaching about worry. That would make a good metaphor for teaching about anxiety. That would make a good metaphor for teaching about stress. This is how you relax someone, so I'm going to talk in this way so that it helps people to relax and fall asleep, etc. People do that with their children. They talk in a way that helps their children, or most people do, talk in a way instinctively that helps their children fall asleep. Very lucky you've got woods nearby. It works purely because you're just following a pattern of communication, and the person picks up on that pattern of communication. But people don't notice consciously when you look in one eye or the other, because we always, as I said, if you watch any drama or something where it does a lot of close up shots, you'll see that people's eyes are darting left and right. If the person only has one eye, you're not going to do it, obviously. But it's just a variation on using head movements. It's just kind of a bit more subtle. So what you would do, for example, once someone closes their eyes, they also can't see what you're doing. So when someone closes their eyes, you would carry on the pattern, perhaps with a head movement. So you might talk with your head facing that way slightly, because your ears, assuming both their ears are working, their ears will have perception, kind of depth perception and location. They'll be able to identify the location of where the voice is coming from. And the more focused they are, the more accurate they are with that. So there are videos out there where um, people I've worked with in front of audiences have then shared their experience and said it felt like I was leaning around talking into one ear and then leaning around and talking into their other ear. And yet the audience could see that I literally would say, okay, so as you listen to me, you can begin to relax. And while you begin to relax, I don't know whether you'll find yourself drifting deeper and more relaxed with the sound of my voice, or whether it'll be that you drift deeper with the spaces between my words. And that small head movement is enough that they think it's as if I've talked right into one ear and then right into the other ear. Um, and so essentially, all you're doing with the eye movement thing is exactly the same. You're looking in one eye, then looking in the other. It's exactly the same as doing it where you're moving your location of your voice. You're just doing a pattern, setting up a pattern. And as long as you follow that pattern, then the person obviously picks up on that pattern in the same way that when people listen to my stuff, they pick up on the pattern of the sort of embedded commands and things. It just, even if I do it subtly, it stands out enough that you pick up on it. And then it ends up, once your brain clicks, there's a pattern there, it starts responding to that. Obviously, you can choose not to respond, but it generally starts responding. Well, they follow it because they are comfortable following it. So if they're not comfortable following it, then they're not obviously going to. Um, if they feel manipulated or anything, the chances are they'll start getting a feeling like you're somehow manipulating them. But if it's in, say someone wants help and you're doing something that's going to help, normally you're doing what they want, and so they don't feel kind of odd about that. Um, and that obviously goes for everyday conversations. In everyday conversations, people talk about like, oh, I was getting so stressed last night, this happened, that happened, whatever. If the person you're talking to starts saying, oh, that sounds like it's really difficult, I bet you wish that you could have relaxed in that situation, or whatever they do, the person isn't going to think, no, how dare you say things that make me start to feel like I'm relaxing and feeling calm about thinking about things that making me stressed. I want to feel stressed. Most people are happy to feel good, and happy when a friend is being supportive and offering supportive information. So that's kind of all you're uh, doing there. You're doing what we do in our everyday life, except that you're doing it in a way that's far more targeted and so likely to be more effective, because you're doing it um, in a way that's actually going to stick to a pattern. So people will do this but not stick to a pattern because they're doing it in everyday life and they're not realizing exactly what they're doing, in the same way that it's normal for someone, say when they're trying to calm a child down or an animal down, to be talking but then end up saying something in a relaxing tone of voice to try and calm that child or animal down. So me doing it, but doing it intentionally, is no different. Let's have a look what people are saying. But I do find it very interesting, obviously, that experience of when you get so focused and you're so responsive that it does sound like the person is literally swinging their head all the way around you when your eyes are shut and they're talking to you. I did have chocolate for breakfast, yes. What was I reading before that? That's an answer to a question, I think. I can't imagine anchoring to a motivated state would necessarily help. Obviously, the things that help with depression are looking at how to make sure you're getting your emotional needs met, um, thinking about your thinking and addressing that. Um, Obviously, reducing emotional rumination, whether that's positive or negative, it doesn't matter, but emotional rumination that triggers obviously too much uh, dreaming and stuff, which then obviously triggers waking up exhausted, etc., etc. And yeah, I think sometimes there is that tendency of needing to just, it's like if you're ill and you miss going to the gym. Like, I'm imagining this is going to happen to a lot of people with the lockdown, that a lot of people have not been able to go out and do the kind of routines that they've been used to doing for a long period of time. And initially, they probably would have felt uncomfortable with the fact they're not doing the routine, even if they didn't realize why. So it's frequent if someone goes to the gym, say 10 a.m. every morning, that um, if you end up ill and so you can't go to the gym, all of a sudden, because you can't go to the gym, you feel restless at home, even though you're ill. You feel restless, like something's missing, but you don't necessarily make the connection that the reason you're feeling restless isn't anxiety or something. It's restless because you're normally exercising at that time and you're in that moment not actually exercising. Um, and obviously, with something like this current situation, there'll be people who obviously are trying to do something about it. Maybe they've got an environment where they can go out and get some exercise, but it's not the same as your very specific routine that you used to have. And yes, I'm trying to reduce saying that, but it's better than saying the C word and talking about that. So yeah, so that ends up uh, being kind of you have to try and get yourself back into that routine, and sometimes have to just start doing it, even if you don't really want to, just to start trying to re-trigger the routine. And obviously, my experience, like many people's experience, is that even when you do that, um, sometimes it just doesn't resonate for you anymore, and it's really, really hard to do it. Um, yeah, good to see you here briefly, Gary. And yeah, I'm kind of aware of how many people get helped, obviously. But yeah, there's a couple of things to deal with the any kind of internet issues. One is obviously, as has been mentioned, to just reduce the resolution down. It may not have to go down to 144p, but just reduce the resolution down, especially if you're on a mobile phone or something, because you don't need full HD, for example, on a mobile phone, because you're only looking at a very small screen. Um, but yeah, just reducing the resolution down, that's one thing that can help. The other one is just pausing it for a few moments. It means you're always slightly behind, but pausing it for a few moments, letting the internet get ahead a little bit, and then unpause. And hopefully, any delays in the internet delay for a period of time, but then catch up, meaning that hopefully that delay never gets to where you're at, or at least not for a while. So there are some bits. But it's just obviously because of the situation we're in, where all internet services are being overused. Oh, you're still here. Um, but yeah, as long as I'm the one that's not slightly behind, then we're okay. Obviously, I started slightly behind because people had been having a 15-minute chat before I arrived. So I had to read through all of a chat to see if there was anything that was directed towards me that I might need to have to respond to or talk about. Well, who was chatting? You'll have to scroll all the way up to the top. But yeah, so and obviously I don't mind having people arrive early. And sometimes, like today, I was watching a reaction video. Taff316, whose videos I like. Um, you should check his reaction videos out if you want to see an American reacting to British things. Um, he was reacting to An Idiot Abroad, and Abby and myself managed to get that on so that it was going to end at, I think, 27 minutes past 7, and then I had to be on here for 7:30. So I had to kind of rush in. Yeah, I think some people are obviously, well, in relation to the situation, there's some people who are obviously struggling, but then the one that I think concerns a lot of people more is those who are perhaps in domestic abuse situations, who are essentially locked down in that situation, which is obviously going to add to tensions and things. Do I have book recommendations on animals and hypnosis? Um, well, hypnosis with animals is, especially with cats and dogs and pets, is my advice is to do exactly what you do with people. You match them and then build rapport with them and then lead them. So you do things like match the cat's blinking and eye movements, and try and sort of match its breathing rhythm, not necessarily by breathing the same because you'll probably hyperventilate, but it could be for like a head movement or something in time with its breathing, and then slowing it down a bit, and gaining attention. But there is obviously the one that I flashed the other day, the Hypnosis of Man and Animals. That book smells very nice. Every time it goes near my head, I smell it. That one's from the 70s, I think. Nope, 1963. Ah, smells nice and old. So that's Hypnosis of Man and Animals. I don't know many books specifically on that topic. Oddly, you'd think there would be more. Yeah, I've known. Well, obviously, I've said before that locally, I was I worked for um, a local domestic abuse service, and when I went for the interview, it was a panel interview. So obviously, you've got like 4 people sat opposite you, interviewing you, and came out of the interview with them contacting me and saying, we'd never ever thought about the idea of hiring a man before, and we'd written you off before you even came in here, and now you've come in here, you convinced us that actually a man could probably work with in domestic abuse. um, and so they ended up hiring me, and I was the first sort of male hired into that role. Part of my argument in the interview was that it seemed to be that they weren't mentioning or highlighting domestic abuse towards males, and what a big issue that is, and how a lot of males get nervous about coming out and saying that they are or have been uh, sort of experiencing domestic abuse. Um, and a lot of males don't kind of fight back, for example, and don't defend themselves in quite the same way as, say, a female might, because of the fear of. Um, so I'm not saying females always do, but a female might hit back or do something like that to try and get out of the house or do something. Whereas there is a tendency for males to worry about how it would be seen if they hit that female who's the one that's doing the abuse. Um, and so there's a whole load of issues obviously there. I did show the shirt yesterday, and obviously I'm wearing the same one again today. It's my one-eyed monster one. I'll show it again in a moment. I think I'd answered that yesterday about people being hypnotized. That I've never yet met someone who can't be hypnotized, but I'm aware that it's very hard, and you can't necessarily hypnotize people who don't have the mental capacity to understand what you're doing. So if you can't gain that engagement in the first place on any level, then so say because of a significant intellectual impairment or brain damage or something, if you can't gain that kind of connection, then it's very hard to hypnotize someone, because what you're trying to do is just focus uh, attention. So all hypnosis is literally all hypnosis is focusing attention and increasing responsiveness. So anyone who's capable of reading a book or playing a computer game or watching a TV show or watching a film or listening to some music, anyone who's capable of any of these things has experienced essentially being hypnotized, has experienced um, focusing on something enough to make it so that you have increased your responsiveness to it. So, for example, if you're reading a book and you focus on that book enough, and that then makes it so that you don't want to stop reading, or it makes it so that you um, start feeling something towards the characters. All of that is you have become more responsive to what it is that you're responding to those words. Um, the same with music. If you listen to music and that music makes you want to dance, or makes you want to sing, or makes you want to, makes you feel something, triggers some kind of emotion within you, or anything like that, you have responded to it. You've focused on it enough to engage with it enough to then respond to it, and so you have become responsive in relation to it. The same with films. You watch a horror film, and I don't know, someone rings the doorbell, and the character goes to the door. They open the door, and because they're thick, because they're in a horror film, they walk out of the door. They roam around their yard, looking to see, oh, who just rung my doorbell on this scary, raining, stormy night. They don't see anyone. They walk back to their house. They walk in, close the door, and then suddenly there's a bad guy there or something. And then they head upstairs because, you always go upstairs where you're trapped when you're in a horror film. And then there's like a moment where it's really tense, and they're hiding, cowering somewhere, and the character's walking their way through, the scary character is walking their way through, searching for them. If you're sat on the sofa and you can feel your muscles tensing, and maybe even feel that you've stopped breathing for a bit because you're so tense watching this scene, you are hypnotized. You've become so focused on it, you've become responsive to it. That's all hypnosis is. And so there is no, deep is an unusual kind of concept, because deep just means you are focused. Deep hypnosis doesn't feel like anything. And this is something that people end up kind of mistaking, that they think hypnosis is going to feel like something. And so they end up saying, I don't think I was hypnotized because I didn't feel hypnotized. And then you think, well, what do you expect hypnosis to feel like? Because hypnosis is just having your attention focused. Milton Erickson described it as hypnosis is focusing attention on what's important here and now. So if someone, for example, came in with depression, you don't want them to be thinking about what shopping they've got to do later. You don't want them to be thinking about whether their hair looks nice. You don't want them to be thinking about whether they left their hair straighteners on before they left home. You want them to be thinking about stuff to do with the depression, stuff to do with what they want changed and how they're going to change it. So if you can get that person in that therapy session to be focused on the therapy at hand, and to have it so their mind is not focused on other things while they're supposed to be focused on what's at hand, you've hypnotized them. You've got them focused on what they're doing, and you can hypnotize people as simple. Well, the definition of hypnosis is essentially having someone follow suggestions. Decide to engage with what you're doing. Um, that's not the official wording for the definition, but it is like a couple of sentences for the American Psychiatric Association or whatever it is, their definition of it, or Psychological Association, the APA, whoever they are. So the idea is you're just narrowing attention onto something so they become responsive to it. And you literally can do that with a question. You can say something to someone like, so how will life be different if you woke up tomorrow and you didn't have your problem? No one told you you didn't have your problem. You just woke up tomorrow and you didn't have your problem. How will life be different? And as soon as you ask that question, if they then engage with the question, so if they say, I don't know, clearly they haven't engaged with it, you haven't hypnotized them. They didn't, they haven't gone with it. They're still detached from you. So you might have to ask follow-up questions. But if they kind of go, now you've hypnotized them. They're considering your question, and they might come back and say, well, I suppose when I wake up, the first thing I'd notice is, or the first thing I'd do is probably just go and make a coffee, or I would do this, or I would do that. They would start answering your question. They've engaged with it. So that's all you're kind of doing with it. And that doesn't feel like something. That process, like I will know, this person is hypnotized, but the person won't know they're hypnotized. And someone being deeply hypnotized, all deep means is that their attention is so focused on it that literally a car could backfire outside the therapy room and the person wouldn't flinch. They wouldn't respond to it. They're so focused on what it is that's going on and what they're doing, and so interested in what they're doing, that they don't notice other distractions. That's the definition of it being deep, is that it's very narrow on that one thing. Deep doesn't mean relaxed in any way. Relaxation and hypnosis are not linked in the slightest. So what I often find is when people talk about deep, they were expecting to somehow be relaxed, when actually relaxation and hypnosis aren't the same thing. And I wouldn't say someone's relaxed if I've just said to them, how will life be different if you didn't have the problem? But if they start engaging in that and we start having this meaningful conversation about that, they're deeply hypnotized. I can suddenly say, oh, it's the end of the time now. And, we're sort of wrapping up. And they'll think, oh, wow, that went quick. And they've been so focused on the therapy, they didn't notice time passing. They didn't notice any distractions outside the therapy room. They didn't think about other things other than just getting on with the therapy. So that's the sign of someone being deeply hypnotized, not someone kind of being deeply relaxed. Someone being deeply relaxed is someone being deeply relaxed. You can be hypnotized online. It's fairly common. When you say you tried two different hypnotists and it never worked, the question there is, how are you defining that it didn't? How are you defining that the hypnosis didn't work, or are you defining it as it didn't work because the therapy didn't work? Because if the therapy didn't work, it might be that they weren't doing therapy that was appropriate, suitable therapy for you. It might be that because hypnosis itself isn't therapy. So if someone hypnotized you and said that problem is going to disappear, that's not therapy, and that's incredibly unlikely to work. And if the world worked as simply as that, then clearly every doctor would just learn how to do that and would just tell their patients when they come into to see them, you're never going to have that problem again, and would send them all home. And also you've then got that thing of, how many sessions did you have that therapy for? Was that enough? Was there incremental progress? So I always use scaling, for example. So I'll scale at the beginning on a scale of say 0 to 10. Where are you now in relation to this problem? With 10 being the problem's the worst it can be, 0 being the opposite. So I never define what the opposite is, but I say 0 being the opposite. Normally people come in saying they're like 9 or 10, and then at different sessions you would say, so where are you now? And you would also get a definition of how they know they're there. So how do you know you're a 10? Well, because X, Y, and Z is what my life is like. So then you would ask things like, so if I were to ask you that and you were to tell me you're a 9, what will be different? How will you know that you're a 9 and not a 10? And so then they'll say, well, because this small change would be different and that small change would happen. And then you would go through some of the numbers like that, meaning that when you get to sessions and you ask, so today, scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the worst the problem can be, 0 being the opposite, where are you now? If they say a 10, you'd say, so how do you know you're a 10? And if they describe something that's different to the 10 that was on the first day, but perhaps is better. So what you often get is that change happens in people's lives and they don't notice the change has happened because they're living their life. And you'll end up being able to show them on a bit of paper, 2 weeks ago, what you're now describing as a 10 is what 2 weeks ago you felt was an 8. And so they then think, so I've made some progress. I just didn't even realize it. So then you've ended up pointing out that in 2 sessions or whatever it's been, they've actually progressed, that 20%. And, you keep that up, you're on the right track to within a few months, perhaps no longer have this problem. Often it's actually quicker than that, but, so there's a difference between the therapy not working and someone doing hypnosis that isn't in your way of being hypnotized. So if someone, for example, if I said to someone, okay, I want you to push down on my hand, push harder and harder and harder, keep pushing harder and harder and harder and sleep. And then I swipe my hand away and click my fingers. If the person absolutely detests that kind of thing and that type of induction, and they don't like shocks and all the rest of it, that's very unlikely to work with them. And they will say it hasn't worked because it's not what they like. Likewise, if I, for example, and perhaps saying things like being very demanding, very sort of assertive and controlling, and saying things like, okay, you're now going to shut your eyes and you're going to go deeply into hypnosis. They might think, no, this just feels intimidating. It doesn't feel, and then, so they're in their head thinking this feels intimidating. I don't like this. I don't like this experience. They're not being hypnotized. They're busy focusing elsewhere on their own experience or on, their own different thinking and on worries and all the rest of it. So if someone hypnotizes you or tries to hypnotize you, but in a way that isn't your way of responding, then obviously that doesn't work because they're not doing it in your way of responding. They're trying to impose their way of doing it upon you. And obviously, to some extent, if you listen to any of my stuff, like my sleep meditations, it's imposed on you because I can only do it one way. But it's not completely imposed on you because you can choose not to listen to it, meaning that if you've chosen to go along with it, clearly on some level, you're okay with that style or that way of going in. But yeah, I had my chocolate breakfast this morning. So yeah, you can be hypnotized online. No reason why not. It's no different. There are some challenges in relation to things like, say it's via Skype or something. There are some challenges like a slight delay can often be occurring. So I can't, say as a hypnotist, necessarily comment on exact things in real time. So you can do the hypnosis perfectly fine, but you just can't do certain techniques as well because you can't get that instant feedback that you get when someone's face to face with you. And likewise, obviously, all my videos can hypnotize people. All my MP3 audio tracks can hypnotize people. People can, for years have been hypnotized by buying self-hypnosis CDs and cassette tapes and records and all the rest of it. So, you can hypnotize people in all sorts of ways. Having a look through. So what's the? Oh, he does that to us all the time. Yes. So obviously, I do hypnotize people all the time. Um, in fact, any time that, well, every single storyteller you've ever heard, if you think, wow, they engage me, they're hypnotizing you because you're allowing them to kind of engage you in that way. Um, so yeah, so I do it in the chats. I do it obviously with every single sleep meditation of mine. I start off with very direct, in my opinion, suggestions around setting up, which is why it's very important that that beginning bit. Some people will say, "Oh, can't you just jump straight into the story?" I don't like having that beginning bit where you talk about us closing our eyes, relaxing, falling asleep, whether it will be, to the sound of your words or the spaces between. Can you just scrap all that? I just want the story. But literally, that 8 seconds or whatever it might take me to say it is incredibly important because that's the kind of the hypnosis bit that sets up using various hypnotic techniques like double binds, embedded commands, um, linking suggestions, presuppositions. All of that's contained within that tiny little 8 seconds or so to set up how you can respond to the rest of it. So people who skip that or people who start future stories part way through rather than going starting at the beginning, if they do that, if they listen often enough, then they'll know it because they'll know all Dan's stories have this. And so you just naturally respond in that way because you've already set yourself up with when I'm listening to Dan, this is what's going on. But if you're new to it, and so you've only heard that beginning once the first time you listened, and then the second time you listen, you skip the beginning because it's an hour and 20-minute story or something, and so you're jumping in at like 30 minutes in, it may not be as effective, partly because of the fact that you've missed the suggestions around what part of what I'm doing is what's going to make you go deeply into a sleep here and what have you. Yeah, I like my shirt too. I've had it for, I think, since 2007. So it's starting to get old, I think. Yeah, so it's trying to separate out the difference kind of between what is hypnosis and what is therapy and the way to know whether you're responding or not. So the way to say the hypnosis isn't working would be I totally didn't respond. I didn't engage in any way. Nothing happened really. But even then, it's hard for people to know that. So, for example, I can't remember when it was. Maybe last year, maybe the year before. I was teaching in London. I was running like monthly training courses in London, and there was someone very intellectual in their way of thinking, approaching the world, who was on the course. And as I've said before, I will just say to the audience, so who wants to come up here to go into hypnosis next? And obviously, that in itself is a hypnotic suggestion. But she volunteered, came up and sat next to me, and she'd been adamant the whole time about how, she really doesn't think that she responds, doesn't think that she doesn't think she's ever been hypnotized, doesn't think she can be because it always seems to fail. And the thing was that she had a kind of disconnect between her responding and her actually kind of doing what needed to be done and what she thought was going on. And so, as a demonstration, I said to her, this is in front of like 30 or 40 or whatever people, I said, in a moment, I'm just going to reach over and I'm going to lift up your left hand. And when I do, I'm not going to ask you to put it down any faster than you go into hypnosis. And then I reached over and I did it really gently. I hovered my hand so that my thumb and finger were either side of her wrist, but I didn't touch her wrist. And she instinctively started lifting her hand up, as people do, lifting her hand up into my grasp. And then I never grasped it. All I did was so I would lower my hand down and you could see her hand move up a bit. And so I then got it to kind of there, not touching her. And then I just, as her hand came up into mine, I just kept moving my hand up. And everyone watching could see. So once her hand was up in the air, I kind of, she still, to all intents and purposes, appeared wide awake, fully alert, appeared like she wasn't remotely hypnotized in terms of like everything other than her arm. She's holding a conversation with me. She's engaging in what we're saying. And I said, so are you hypnotized now? And she said, no, I don't think so. I don't think you've started yet. And I said, well, then how did your arm get in the air? And I said, well, you just lifted it there and put it there. And so I'm obviously just doing as you told me to, which is to hold my arm here because that's what you told me to do. And so I then turned to the audience and said, did I lift her arm? And they all kind of unanimously said, no, I never touched her arm. She had demonstrated that she was hypnotized by the fact that the suggestion or, the idea of lifting her arm I'd done, and she was responsive and had responded to the idea, and that responsivity had increased enough that she was responding, and she lifted her arm up, she put her arm in the air, and she held her arm there. I never touched her arm, but her belief was she didn't feel hypnotized, she didn't feel relaxed, she didn't have her eyes closed, she was able to hold a perfectly normal conversation with me. The only reason her arm was there was because I'd lifted it there and put it there, which is the one thing I hadn't done. And so that was kind of proving the point to the audience and then educating her as well, that you can be hypnotized and literally have absolutely no conscious idea that you've been hypnotized. You don't realize that you were being responsive. Like she didn't realize she was being responsive and that she was following the suggestions and lifting her arm up and doing everything as expected without me having to do anything at all. And so it can be hard for someone to know whether they've been hypnotized or not, because the only way to know is, was I responding? Was I responding as I needed to? Yes, I've glanced at the time. Um, yeah, if your mind was wandering and you were thinking about other things and you were looking at the clock and what have and out the door and all the rest of it and were finding it hard to focus, then my assumption is that they weren't holding your focus. If they noticed you doing those things, so for example, if I saw you having your mind wander off, I would talk about you can just let your mind wander. And then if I saw you gaze over at a clock, I'd say, and perhaps you can notice the clock. And then if I saw you gaze outside the door, I'd say, or maybe you can look outside the door. And I would be taking kind of control, so to speak, of your jumping your focus around, so that actually you start following that focus. And then I'd start adding things in, like, and perhaps you could notice the sound of, and then I'd name like a sound, and then you think, oh yeah, I can hear that. And so I would start directing, I'd start following your lead first, following what you're focusing on, and then I would start directing that focus, adding little bits in until gradually it narrows down onto one thing. But obviously everyone's different, but just from that brief description there, that's the kind of thing I would end up doing. And it's a bit like Milton Erickson had someone who said, no one's ever been able to hypnotize me. No one's ever been able to hypnotize me because I refused to sit down for psychiatrists. And the man was pacing up and down his office, and Erickson just sort of said, well, yeah, obviously, no one can hypnotize you because you just spend all your time pacing, like now, where you're walking all the way to the end, and then you're going to reach the end, turn around, and walk back again, and then he started describing what the man was doing in real time, and then said, and it's okay, I know that you're going to notice that the chair's there, but don't sit in it, because obviously I also don't want you to feel like you've got to sit down in my office. Just keep walking up and down. And then every now and then he'd comment on the chair. and the guy would obviously every now and then look over towards the chair until eventually the guy ended up walking to the chair and sitting in it. So you meet someone where they're at and then work from there, rather than trying to impose your way of this is how everyone has to do it. So, for example, I've told the story before about the ADHD person who had said, no one can hypnotize me, no one can do meditation with me because I've got ADHD, so I can't focus, etc. I found out he liked mountain biking, so I spoke to him about mountain biking, and then that was good enough for him. That was what hypnotized him. And I never spoke about relaxation. I never did the things that he found incredibly boring that every other person had done. Everyone else said, just sit there, close your eyes, and just focus all of your attention on your breathing. And he'd be there thinking, my hands are restless, my feet want to jiggle, I want to scratch, I'm starting to get restless. And he wouldn't be doing what he was told to do because he just couldn't focus. Um, so, yeah, you haven't totally hijacked the chat. I have to talk about something, and maybe others are finding it interesting too. Yeah, there's not much brain to pick, so you don't need too many people picking it. The other one is being aware of natural rhythms. So a good hypnotherapist is likely, or good therapist generally, is likely to do sessions that are about 90 to 120 minutes long, so that you know the person naturally in that period of time is going to naturally drop into hypnosis. So we naturally go internal and drop into like a daydreamy state for about 20 minutes every 90 to 120 minutes. So if a therapist makes a session, say 2 hours long, then at some point during that 2 hours, they will see their client starts to gaze off and the client's eyes defocus. And it's at that point when all the therapist has to do is soften their voice and just encourage going with that. And you don't have to do any hypnosis other than that. You just literally say, you know, when you just take a moment to go with that, you can close your eyes for a moment if you want and just drift into that thought. And that's it. You've done it. They go with it. Just scrolling down. Yeah, got to the 45-minute message. 15 minutes late, nearly. Yeah, that would annoy me. I get annoyed when people cancel on me. I'm very much even if you're nearly dead, if you've made a plan, I just want that plan to be stuck to because I hate uncertainty and everything. And I think, I would never, even if I was virtually dead, I would never cancel a plan if I'd made it because of routines and clarity and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, I had a company suggest, oh, you might get more people watching your videos if you ditch your introduction, your kind of like, subscribe, share kind of introduction, which is like 26 seconds long or something. I think the bit including the title, where I sort of give the title of whatever the sleep meditation is something like 28 seconds for the whole thing, or 26 seconds for the whole thing, one or the other. And I sort of said, well, I added that because I never used to have that, because instinctively you do that at the end of a video. And I always knew I can't do it at the end of a video because if I do it at the end, obviously I can't send people to sleep and they go, right, if you found this helpful, feel free to like and subscribe, and then bring them straight back out again. Obviously, that's stupid. So I never used to include it, and then never used to get subscribers and people liking my videos and all that sort of stuff. Or obviously I did, but very, very small numbers. And then I was on a YouTube training course with YouTube, and they said, if you include this bit, it literally makes hundreds of percent difference to how many people subscribe. So I thought, well, that's worth giving it a go. Let's see if I put it at the beginning instead. Put it at the beginning. It annoyed some people. Some people obviously said, I'm giving this a thumbs down because you've asked me to give it a thumbs up if I like it. I don't know if I like it yet. So out of spite, I'm giving it a thumbs down. And so you have to get over the fact there are people that are idiots. But then what I noticed was literally straight away, those videos generated like 4 or 5 times more likes and subscribes than I was getting when I didn't have that. And so recently, when a company, a sort of YouTube company thing that tries to help people with their channel said, oh, if you ditched that bit because you don't have it, it goes straight into the story. It means that people will instantly then know whether they like the story or not, meaning that they'll either hang around or they won't, but they'll make that decision rapidly. And I said, but I think that if I don't tell people to like and subscribe, if I just have it written on screen, which is what was being recommended, I don't think people will pay much attention. People who I know, who, like you guys here, who watch my stuff, you'll probably like it or whatever anyway, because you're kind like that. But people who are stumbling on my stuff, who don't know anything about me, they won't even think to like just because it says it on screen. And I said, and also the other thing is, it's about sleep. If someone puts it on their mobile phone, for example, presses play and then has to get themselves sort of all the farting around you do to actually get settled in bed, they're going to end up thinking, I'm going to have to rewind it now because I've just missed the beginning. And so they're going to keep on having to pull it back to the beginning. Whereas if you've got that like 26 seconds, you've got 26 seconds from when you press play to get yourself settled in bed, get yourself sorted, make sure your lights are off, make sure you're comfy, and then the story starts. You've got 26 seconds or so to do all of that in, rather than got to go back and restart it again. And so I did it for a couple of videos, as you will have noticed, and proved my point. Literally, my subscribers on an average video would be maybe 28 subscribers in 7 days that I would gain from a video. And on the videos I did that on, it was about 3. So the difference between one and the other was huge. So I went back to my old ways. I will go shortly. I will wrap up shortly, but I want to make my way down to the bottom first. Yes, I get very confused because most therapy appointments are normally a therapeutic hour, which is 50 minutes. And the trouble with a 50-minute hour is that normally therapists find that the work just gets started. The client suddenly reveals all this stuff when you're about to send them home. And that is just stupid that therapists seem to still do that. That's hanging on just to a ritual, essentially. Essentially, it's like, well, this is the way we've always done it, so this is what we're going to do. I'm just scrolling back to see if there's anything else I missed before I go back down to carrying on talking about that. Yeah, block off 3 hours. This definitely won't go on for 3 hours. I'm going to make sure of that, even if I have to put my foot down on myself. And the thing with obviously if someone has PTSD is that ideally you want that treated, you want the therapist to focus on that as their focus of treatment, and get that dealt with ideally in that first session so that you don't have that PTSD. Obviously then you can move on to working on whatever else is around that PTSD, but at least you've got rid of that part in the first or second session, so that people aren't kind of having to focus elsewhere, or look for danger cues. Yeah. So the whole thing with 50-minute sessions, I think, is really, really stupid because we have. So I've got. I'm not going to go through them all now, but obviously I've got lots of books about things like our ultradian rhythm. So we have lots of rhythms, biological rhythms and stuff. One of them is our basic rest and activity cycle, which back in the 70s, the US government were getting a bit annoyed that well, it's not the government, but it was the Air Force were getting really annoyed that their pilots would seem to lose kind of focus for about 20 minutes every hour and a half to 2 hours, and this would annoy them because it was like we need pilots to be focused 100% of the time, not losing focus for this period of time, and so they started trying to research what on earth this thing was that was going on. And then it turned out it's the basic rest and activity cycle that every single one of us has, and so we and it's a natural part of our being. So that's why a lot of activities that humans end up doing are roughly in slots of about 90 minutes, because that's what fits before we then think I need to take a break now. And your mind starts wandering. So normally anything that goes on longer than 90 minutes, say if there's a 3-hour film or something, will have a bit somewhere about 90 minutes in where things get a bit lighter and a bit easier to let your mind wander before getting back into more action and stuff. But we naturally fall into these habits. So Ernest Rossi wrote a book, The 20-Minute Break, that's all about how to live a life following your natural ultradian rhythms. So it's a very easy to read book, unlike many of his other books. But I always make sure my sessions, I block out 2 hours and then try and ideally get the client out of the session in about 1 hour 50, so that I've got 10 minutes before the next person comes in for like toilet breaks and having a cup of tea or something. So yeah, I'm just working my way down, but I will end shortly. I promise. Yeah. So obviously, in relation to when I encounter people who frequently cancel plans, I personally just feel I'd rather not have made the plan, because that's obviously being autistic. My thing is, the thing that makes me just literally lose the plot and really struggle to cope is when it's like, right, today you're waking up and at 8 a.m. you're doing this, at 9 a.m. you're doing that, at 10 a.m. you're going and doing this, you'll be stopping for lunch at say 1 or 2 p.m. You're then going to be doing that at that time, coming home at this time, watching The Simpsons at that time, and then having an evening meal and then doing this then. And I need that structure and what have you. And so for someone to kind of say, oh, we'll decide in the morning what we're going to do. That's like, well, no, we need to know before the morning what we're going to do. So I'm obviously very aware that sometimes things just don't pan out. But anywhere in my life so any friends I've got or any people I've got who know who would be unpredictable, who would end up not sticking to plans consistently, even if I make plans with them, I always assume I've not actually made any plans with them. I don't expect them to stick to it, so that I've got the certainty that, as far as I'm concerned, they're not going to stick to it. And if they do, I then have to deal with the uncertainty of the fact I'm now doing a plan with this person. So people in my life where that's kind of how they are, the way to get my head around it is to say, I'm making this plan for, say, Tuesday morning. They're going to let me down. They're not going to be there. It's not going to happen. So I'm going to make plans for what it is I'm going to do instead. But I'll find something I'm going to do instead that if it does end up that they turn up or something, then that happens. But I just don't expect it. So I do my best to make sure that I'm not then, when they end up texting that morning saying we're not going to turn up, I don't end up kind of being really wound up by that and then having the whole day ruined because I'm still not being able to break my focus off the fact that my plans have been ruined and my focus, my sort of structure of the day has been ruined. And it's another one of those things that also there's a number of things that make it so that I just think I would rather not interact with people, not have people in my life. And that's obviously one of them, is that I'd rather think, you know what, I'm better off without friends, because if I don't have friends, I don't have to deal with the uncertainty. I don't have to deal with um, mistakes in communication. I don't have to deal with all the things that go with people. Um, but then at the same time, I'm aware, and I've obviously talked about this quite a lot, of the fact that there runs the risk that when you're like 70 or something, or 80, suddenly you're alone because you've literally pushed everyone away. And so when you get to the point where you need people, so selfishly, you need people to be able to support you in your old age or something, you've pushed them all away because most of your life, people were a hindrance to your life. And now you suddenly need them. So yeah, yes, we've hit our hour, 10 minutes past it. Yes, I know you're not trying to shove me off. It's me trying to stick to my own boundaries of trying to make sure that I'm not overworking by doing all these kind of 3 hour late night. What to me, by the time I finish 3 hours, ends up being late night extra work, and then not having rest time, so to speak. Yes, I'll say hello to Abby when I go to bed, or when I see her. I assume she's in the bedroom. Yeah, it's the same in care homes. That in care homes, and I quite like it, but in care homes, your shifts are normally really long. So, for example, in one home that I worked in doing residential care with challenging teens, you'd be on shift for, if you were lucky enough to go home, you'd be on shift for 15 hours. Um, but if you didn't go home, you're on shift for 24 hours and 30 minutes. So that's 24 hours, and then you do a 30-minute handover the next morning to the staff coming on shift. I personally love those shifts because you get everything done in one day, and you have more days off because you're doing all the work literally in a whole day. Um, but you would often obviously come on work at 8 a.m. and at sort of 4 or 5 a.m., you're still trying to get the teenagers to sleep. Uh, and so even if you're doing the shift where you're scheduled to go home, the reality is you are not allowed to go home until all the kids are asleep and all the paperwork is done. So I normally used to prefer to just say, look, can't I just be scheduled to sleep in? Because then I don't have to worry about the whole going home thing and having to go home at like 5 in the morning, thinking, wow, this is really worth it. I'm going home at 5 in the morning. I'd rather just fall asleep for an hour or two and then wake up and carry on, being on shift. Um, but yeah, so even if you went home, it could be like 3, 4 in the morning or whatever. The children finally go to bed. You now have hours of paperwork to write up, and so you don't end up going home anyway. But then there was another home I worked in where they did 3.5 days on, 2 days off, 3.5 days on, 2 days off. Um, that I really didn't like, because if it was a bit of a nightmare and you were being targeted, say the youths in the home decided, we're going to pick on that member of staff and we're going to make their life hell for the duration they're on shift. It's not just a case of, well, I've only got this for a day and then I'm off home for a couple of days. It's, you've got this for 3.5 days now before you go off shift. And obviously care work is exempt from the working times directives here in the UK. So you don't get breaks, you don't get to get away from the situation. If you're in it, you're in it. Um, you eat when the kids are behaving well enough for all of you to be able to eat. Um, so you could go the whole time and not have any food. You can go the whole time and not have any sleep. If there's even one child awake, you then can't go to sleep. So so I wasn't so much a fan of the 3.5 days on, 2 days off shift, but I didn't mind the 24-hour ones, because you knew it was over with in 24 hours time. But yeah, I do like the reminders because I'm very good at going over. Yeah, so I'm okay with some of the nuances in time, like plans, but I'm not good with the So what are we doing tomorrow? I don't. We'll figure it out in the morning. Yeah, I kind of want to know. And then if it's like, okay, tomorrow we're going to do this, and then we don't, or if we're going somewhere, what train are we catching? Oh, I don't know. We'll just see what train the time the train leaves when we get there. And invariably, you get there 2 minutes after the train that would have been great to catch has gone, and then you realize you've now got like an hour or something left to wait for the train. But had you made the plan and the train that you're going to catch up front, you would have aimed for that train and caught it. So I like to have really clear plans of these things. But I will be going shortly. I keep saying that, but I haven't reached the bottom of this list yet. Do I miss working with kids? Not in the slightest. I never. It was never something to miss. I never wanted to work with anyone. Um, I've never ever wanted to work with people. I've never set out to be a therapist or do therapy or work with children or families or anything. I've just fallen into it or stumbled into it to try and avoid other things normally. So I was working washing up at Butlins holiday camp. Um, I liked doing that job. It was a nice menial job. It was loading a dishwasher and unloading a dishwasher. I didn't have to interact with any human beings as most of the time. I was left to my own devices. Um, I could have done that job for the rest of my life. Um, but Butlins was closing for a refurbishment. I had worked there over 18 months at that point, meaning that I was classed as a full time member of staff who couldn't be just laid off. So you're a contract member of staff on like a summer contract, and then you get like an autumn contract, and then a winter contract, like over Christmas and New Year period. And then they do another, like a spring contract through to the summer. But once you've worked in employment, having your contracts renewed beyond 18 months, you get classed as a full time member of staff and they can't lay you off at the end of a contract. They have to find work for you. And so they were closing and then doing a refurbishment, meaning that I had to suddenly go and gut chalets and be with people. And there was absolutely no way I did it for part of one day. And before the end of that one shift of having to do that, I told myself I will never be back here ever again while it's under, while I'm not doing my normal job. And so I walked out, went to the job centre. Back in those days, they had all of the postcards around the walls with all the jobs on. And I was just looking for the words, no experience necessary. And the first job I found saying no experience necessary was working in mental health. And so I took the postcard down, went to the counter, said I'd like to try and get this job. They phoned up the number on the card. Um, the manager of the care home, said, I'll send him down to the home now. We'll do an interview with him. So I then walked down the road, had an interview, and they said, we'll give you the job. And so I never went back to Butlins at that point. I just now was working in mental health. And then had obviously training around working with people with schizophrenia, manic depression, as it was kind of termed back then, and OCD. There was autistic people in the homes. You had training around autism. That was the first time I'd had training around autism, and that was the first time I'd even heard of autism. Um, so I had all that training, did that job. Um, it paid a bit better than Butlins paid, and because I really wanted to be doing just the washing up, because now I was doing a job where I was interacting with people all the time. When Butlins reopened after the refurbishment, I was asked if I wanted to come back because my manager wanted me doing the job I was good at, and so I went back part time. So I did. I actually went back full time, but I had a full time job, so I was doing the care work full time, and then around my full time job, I was doing Butlins full time as my part time sort of second job. So I was doing 35, 45 plus a sleep in, 35, 45, 55, 65, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80. I was doing 80 hours a week plus a sleep in the care home to do the two jobs. But because I was choosing when I worked for my full-time Butlins job, I couldn't. I was no longer a manager there because I was a senior member of staff. I just wanted to be a normal bog standard, do the washing up member of staff. But lots of people kept asking me for advice all the time, and the new managers hated that. And so in those days, the pay used to be, you'd have it written on a sheet of paper when you worked, and then you'd have that sheet of paper, a smart, sort of clean version of that written up at the end of a week, because obviously there'd be people who are off sick and stuff. So that first one would get messy. A clean one would be written up at the end of the week, sent to payroll, and then on the Tuesday or whatever afterwards, you get paid what it said. And my managers at the time, so not the main manager of the venue, but the managers who oversaw the different departments, kept on not putting my name down on the final sheet. And they said, we're not going to ever put your name down on the final sheet. We don't like you working here. We don't like the fact that all the staff come to you and not us when they've got problems and they want to know what to do. Because they were all largely new and I wasn't. I'd been there for ages. And so out of spite, I worked there for about 4 months unpaid, doing 45 hours a week, because I wasn't prepared to let them kick me out just by not paying me. And then on my last day, which was at the height of summer, I took the pot wash machine to pieces, every single nut and bolt and every single bit of it, cleaned it thoroughly and left it in neat piles on the floor, and then left my shift when so just walked out of my job. Essentially, it wasn't like I'd handed my notice in. I walked out again, but I left the pot wash machine. So it was totally unexpected. And then I left the pot wash machine in pieces on the floor, so that at the time when literally Butlins is its busiest, at the height of summer, when there's thousands of customers every single day coming through the venue, they had no pot wash machine to wash anything with because it was in pieces. And I did the job when the machine was fitted. I was the only one that took the time to know how to take the machine to pieces and put it back together again. I knew not a single person in Butlins knew how to do it. They'd have to get the engineers down who deal with that specific item. And that would mean calling them up and arranging for when they can come and all the rest of it. It wouldn't be a quick thing. And that's how I left it. But yeah, so I kind of stumbled into the mental health job. They then said, we're changing your rota. I then said, well, then I'm leaving on the day you change it because I'm not prepared to have it change. And so I stumbled into doing work with, I just did the same thing again. Is there any job that's unskilled that's available? And there was a job that said, work in children's homes with children with severe challenging behavior, teenagers with severe challenging behavior, no skills necessary. So I thought, well, I've got some care skills, so maybe I might do a bit better in the interview if anyone else turns up with skills. Went for the job and got offered the job and ended up now working in residential children's homes, dealing with teenagers with challenging behavior. And then from there, I was facing discrimination. I approached the union about it. They said, there's nothing we can do. You can either stay and be a thorn in their side or just quit. So be a thorn in their side and then leave on your terms, or just quit. And so I thought, well, I'll stay and be a thorn in their side and then I'll leave on my terms. But I still carried on looking for, is there any jobs available that I could do that pay as well as this or better? And then I got a job helping to set up a therapeutic children's home. So again, I just stumbled into that. And then after that, having been ran over and whatever, I needed another job again. And so I stumbled into then working in parenting and supporting parents. And before that, I'd worked with people with domestic abuse. Um, and so I just kind of stumbled my way through these jobs, never really, never really having it as this is what I want to do. It's always been this is what this is what I have to do. This is just what I am doing. It's just this is what I've got the skills or the knowledge for. So this is what I do. And then in relation to things like private clients, it was a similarish thing. I'm fascinated by psychology, by trying to work out communication. So that obviously being autistic, I want to understand communication, understand like facial expressions, body language, how to improve my way of interacting with people. So I then obsessively study about these subjects. And then if you're obsessively studying the subjects, you start ending up thinking, right, what's the next course that can teach me what I want to know? And so you end up now training as a therapist. And then suddenly, next minute, you're a qualified therapist. You end up getting yourself registered because you think, well, if I'm a qualified therapist and I can get myself registered, then if I need the extra income, I can perhaps see some clients. And so you then start seeing clients because you need the extra income because most jobs don't pay particularly well. And so you're suddenly seeing clients and doing therapy, and you've still got this obsession. And so you part of the therapy is, oh, this helps me to learn because now these clients give me real world rather than it just being like textbook stuff and stuff on a course where everyone complies. On a training course, you sit opposite someone and you say, right, we're going to have you all doing this technique with the person you're opposite. And obviously the person opposite does exactly what they're supposed to do because it's a fake situation and you're supposed to be following along. The technique as well as the person who's going to do it with you knows the technique. So you both engage. Whereas in reality, a client doesn't know the technique. You're the only one that knows the technique. You're trying to help clients through techniques or whatever it is you're doing. So that gave me a lot of extra knowledge by having that kind of interaction with people. But I'd always vowed that at the first opportunity when I don't need the income, I would stop doing one-to-one client sessions. I was more of a person that liked teaching stuff to people or sharing knowledge than someone who wanted to do therapy and force myself to be interacting. But then I like the idea of like writing stuff. So just being in a room on my own, sharing knowledge, and then putting it out there so others know that knowledge as well. But again, I fell into teaching live classes for the same kind of reason, that I just stumbled into this whole, people will pay me to learn what I know. So that helps with my income. So it had been kind of, and as soon as I had the opportunity not to have to do client sessions, I stopped doing that. I had said to my employers frequently, I'm looking forward to when I no longer have to work with children and families and stuff, and that I didn't like doing it, didn't want to do it, but was doing it because it's what pays my bills. So I'd made that very clear with all my managers constantly, but seemed to be okay at doing the job. So obviously, and at teaching other staff how to do that sort of work. So it had always been a case of as soon as I get the opportunity to not have to see clients, I'll stop. As soon as I get the opportunity to not have to teach courses live, I would stop, which is why the only thing I'm doing this year, depending on how the year goes, is the UK Hypnosis Convention. And that's because Adam Eason kept on asking, come on, we really want you to do it. You never ever do it. You never do any of these conventions. You never come and teach anything. You intentionally sort of avoid it. So for Adam, I said, okay, I'll do it this sort of once. So I'm going and teaching at the UK Hypnosis Convention. But largely, I try my best not to end up doing client sessions, not to end up doing teaching sessions. And ideally, I would like to not have to do online teaching sessions as well. But I haven't reached a point in my life where I'm able to ditch that as well. And obviously, I've made it very clear numerous times that I'm trying to write my 10 hypnotherapy revealed books, so that then if anyone ever asks me questions about hypnosis, I can just say it's in the book. And I don't have to then, I can then kind of disappear into obscurity, so to speak, around hypnosis and parenting and all that stuff, and just not be known for any of that. Hopefully, people can forget me about all that. And if they do ask, I've got it in books. Just look at the book if you're interested. If you don't want to look in the book, you're obviously not interested enough to know that bit of information specifically from me, so you can find it elsewhere. Just scrolling down. I'm still determined not to do a 3-hour stream. Just reading. Yep, we're all obviously wired differently. Yep, menial jobs are good. Over here, mental health jobs like working in care homes, like mental health care homes, any of these other sort of care homes, working in things like care homes for children, young people, anything like that, any kind of care work is largely just classed as no experience necessary. It's an unskilled job, essentially, um, like on paper, which is odd. Well, it wasn't so much keeping it to under an hour today. The plan was to keep it to an hour. Glad that the stories help. Yeah, I always go over an hour because there's constant questions, and I answer the questions. um, just reading down. I think I'm actually better at sticking to things like ultradian rhythm type things, so our basic rest and activity cycle, than I am at sticking to an hour. There's another good reason not to be a therapist sticking to an hour. Don't know. I can't think of anything Jedi mind training wise that anyone would be interested in learning. I was diagnosed in my mid 30s, autistic. I'd suspected it since my early-ish 20s. Um, when I was working in children's homes, and the staff would often joke about how similar I was to some of the kids who were autistic, and I used to kind of laugh it off because I did have similar behaviours to them, but I used to just laugh it off with the staff and not make a big thing of it. Um, and had never wanted a label as such because I felt that people end up known as the label sometimes, and even knowing themselves as the label instead of as a human being, and then ended up, so you end up, but it wasn't until I needed help, until I became depressed and had faced so much discrimination, and now the discrimination was reaching a point where I was very depressed about it. That's when I then sought a diagnosis to see if I was autistic or not. And if I wasn't autistic, I wanted to know what it was that was wrong with me that meant that I was so different to everyone else. But I had strongly suspected, especially given that I'd worked like 15 years or whatever at that point with autistic people and had lots of autism training and stuff. I strongly suspected I was autistic, but I also didn't want to self-label. So I didn't want to kind of say, I never told anyone, like I wouldn't say like on YouTube, oh, I'm autistic, even if I thought I was, because that would end up kind of, I don't like the idea of people self-labeling as such. There's no harm in someone saying they think they could be, but the idea of people saying I am without actual medical kind of diagnosis of that, I feel there are so many people that misunderstand what something is and then say they are something, like the number of people that would say, I have OCD, and then they'll end up, you'll sort of explore it, oh, that must be really difficult for you, and they'll say, well, yeah, I like things straight and I like things organized, and you think that's not OCD. Trust me, if it was OCD, you'd be kind of, it's an anxiety based thing. It wouldn't be just, oh, I like things organized. I have had people say about reminding of Chris Packham. And but I'm not going to answer about the school thing now because that'll just make it go on. But I answered that last week. I did a whole bunch of 3-hour videos on autism and on that kind of thing. So not going to cover that here, but because it'll be just covering stuff I covered last week. But so I am going to go now. It's been like an hour and 37 minutes, so it's only 37 minutes over. And I will be back tomorrow. I don't know what we'll do tomorrow, but I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll see where it takes us. Obviously, people can think of ideas of things you might want to ask. Welcome back and goodbye again, Ellen. So people can think of things that they might want to ask tomorrow, and I'm happy to then sort of get into those bits and pieces. But I'll see you here. Oh no, tomorrow is Monday, isn't it? So I won't be doing this tomorrow. I won't be doing this tomorrow. I will be doing the proper sleep meditation live stream. So 10 p.m. tomorrow night, my time, I'll be doing the sleep meditation live stream where you lot give me ideas and I somehow turn it into some kind of a meditation for you. So so that's 10 p.m. tomorrow night. So I will see you then. Thank you again for all joining me here. Feel free to give a thumbs up, subscribe if you're not subscribed. And 10 p.m. tomorrow night. And I struggle with what day of the week it is. So goodbye everyone. Thanks for being here.